Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Let's talk about the upside of mental illness, the benefits that engaging in what we call mental illness often provides. This might sound like a really weird thing to say because people are so used to thinking of mental illness as something that entirely has downsides and something that people are just suffering from helplessly without any benefits. But the more time I've spent in the trenches of seeing clients professionally, the more I've come to the conclusion that that's not a very useful way of looking at things. So, the first idea I want you to consider is that a diagnosis of mental illness is not an actual medical diagnosis. It's not a literal diagnosis. It's a metaphorical diagnosis, meaning that when someone gets diagnosed with depression or social anxiety or whatever diagnosis they might get, um, these are not based upon objective medical tests. They're based upon observing behaviors and questions in the office. And then, based upon how you behave and how you respond to the questionnaires, the practitioner will diagnose you as suffering from a mental illness. My favorite quote comes from the late psychiatrist Thomas Sauss, who used to use this analogy. He said that, look, if you go into a bar and you ask the bartender for a screwdriver, he's not going to throw you a working tool across the counter. He gets that it's a metaphor. You're not at all asking for an actual screwdriver. So in this sense, screwdriver is a metaphor. You're going to get a drink with some combination of vodka and orange juice. So understand that the metaphorical screwdriver, the beverage with vodka and orange juice, stands in relation to the literal working tool, screwdriver, in the same way that a diagnosis of mental illness stands in relation to an actual brain disease, such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or a brain tumor, right? So this is a metaphorical diagnosis. The second thing I want to impress upon you is that then what we call mental illness is a doing. It's something that we're actually doing. It's a way of thinking, making meaning, believing, feeling, and behaving in relation to ourselves, other people, and the world. And you can view it as strategic in many ways. The late psychiatrist Milton Erickson used to say that neurosis is the inability to communicate directly. So I'm going to invite you to view what's often labeled as symptoms as forms of indirect communication. Now, some people are going to be on my case and label me as lacking compassion and making fun of people who are suffering and that I'm devoid of empathy and so on and sorts for making these claims. I would say quite the contrary. Viewing these as forms of indirect communication and ways of relating and communicating gives people more hope and more choice and more sense of agency than the passive suffering role. So here's another thing I want you to consider before I go into some case stories from my practice. When we use language, we have a tendency to take live dynamic processes and seemingly turn them into fixed objects and things. So people might come into my office and say, "We have a terrible relationship." And I might then ask them, "Well, how are you relating in a terrible way?" And this often gets some laughs and some chuckles or some confusion. But if you think about it, a relationship is not a thing, it's a process of relating. So in the same way, when someone comes in and says, "I'm suffering from depression," I might ask, "Okay, so how are you relating to life in a depressing way?" It's way more accurate to say that the person is depressing or relating to their marriage, for example, in a depressing way, or that the person is anxietizing or phobicking. Like instead of saying that they're suffering from a phobia, it's more accurate to say that they are phobicking, which respects the fact that this is a process that they are actually engaged in. So let's look at some benefits. Let's look at chronic pain. Now, chronic pain is not thought of as a so-called mental illness, even though I would make the claim that most chronic pain is generated by psychological factors. So I recently spoke with a guy who used to work offshore, and usually whenever he went home, for the first few days, he would have strong migraine attacks. And what he kind of concluded down the road was that, coming home to a nagging wife who would pester him with things to do and engage in a lot of complaining, that he was kind of dreading going home. And migraining, the activity of migraining, and I've seen this same thing with many clients, may then be a way of dealing with the stress in a socially acceptable way. Instead of showing one's actual emotions, which may threaten the marriage or the relationship, we might then, set boundaries, be left alone a bit, get some appreciation and some support by not directly asking for it. So we might get some of the benefits, but without quite so much of the risk. I spoke to a nurse I saw as a client a little while back who had been trained in a very strict medical model, and she said that she realized that there was a huge psychological component to chronic pain when she divorced her husband, her former husband. Whenever her husband would come home, she would get these intense headaches, and whenever he left, she would have a sense of relief. So sometimes pain or symptoms can be forms of communicating, perhaps telling us indirectly to stand up for ourselves or to get out of a relationship or to set a boundary of sorts. So let's look at, for example, some of the typical things. Let's look at depressing. You might say, what on earth could be the benefits of depressing? Clearly, you've never been depressed, or you would never make such a cold-hearted comment. Well, let me share with you the case of a guy I worked with many, many years ago. His daughter had been born with cerebral paralysis. And this guy was used to dealing in the business world where you can often negotiate and, find a different supplier and stuff like that. But when his daughter was born with cerebral paralysis, his daughter needed help around the clock, and him and his wife, who were both active in business essentially, were forced to deal with the Norwegian bureaucracy. And the thing is that the people who do the best in bureaucracy are often people who are used to working in the public sector, who know how to manipulate that particular system. And their daughter did not get the help that she needed. And they were fighting this uphill battle against these bureaucrats. And my client had the experience that no matter how he reasoned or what he tried to do, nothing worked. And his anger levels and his frustration levels went through the roof. And he was afraid that he might hurt someone, like physically hurt someone in that system. And then he found himself going into a deep depressive funk. Now, that sucks. You know, I'm not claiming that that's fun or nice in any way, but like William Glasser used to say, he used to say that if we didn't have the capacity to choose to depress, homicide rates would probably be way higher. So one function moving into that depressive mode likely served for him was to essentially numb him down and pull the brakes, so to speak, get him out of the water and reduce his stress levels by having a deep sense of hopelessness and helplessness. At least he didn't hurt anyone or do anything too foolish. So sometimes the ability to depress seems to be a emergency brake of sorts. And then what people sometimes call a relapse can be the result of the person re-entering the context, not knowing how to navigate the territory or their own experience better. They're building up their rage and frustration levels again, and then the brain might kick in and go, we're pulling you out of the water again. Sometimes depressing can be a way of kind of maintaining our own identity. So, for example, if you had a friend who, let's say his wife left him or something like that, and you're trying to get your friend to be social again and maybe perhaps to meet someone new, and your friend might say, well, I know I kind of should, but I'm just too depressed right now. This might be this is a valid response. It's not that, but it may be a way of saying, look, I can deal with my current levels of frustration, but facing more rejection or more hassles is more than I can deal with. So I'll prefer to stay with my current levels of frustration, which still kind of suck. I remember I worked with an architect student once who was very perfectionistic, had very high demands of himself in terms of succeeding. He had to succeed, he had to be best in his class. And then after a while, he kind of realized that that wasn't going to happen. And he flipped 180. So he went into a deep depressive funk where nothing mattered, didn't care about anything, had no interest in architecture or his studies. And people around him, of course, thought that, he had completely changed. But this was essentially two different manifestations of the exact same absolutistic mindset. Sometimes when people claim to have lost all motivation and to not care at all, not saying that this is always the case, but it may be a person who is having very strong demands on themselves to succeed, and they kind of realize that on some level that it's not going to happen. So they completely flip into it meaning nothing and having no significance. And a diagnosis then of depression can also provide them with a kind of face-saving alibi of, I could be best in class. I would have been a raging success hadn't it been for this mental illness that I'm suffering from. So these are sometimes ways of doing things. Now, sometimes we might use depressing as a way of indirectly saying no. I'd like to go with you, or I'd like to do that, but my depression won't allow me. It's a socially acceptable way of setting a boundary, of saying no, getting what you want in that sense, but without being personally accountable for it. So that might be going on, sometimes too. Also, consider this. Um, if you look at addictions or suicidal thoughts, for everyone else, it looks like a problem. For the person who's engaging in it, it's a solution. Might not be a great solution, might not be a good long-term solution, but given the thinking and the believing and the state of mind that they're in, it somehow seems like the best solution. So if I drink all that whiskey or chain smoke or overeat or shoot heroin or gamble or whatever, my mind is racing, my stress level is really high. What the person's really looking for is landing, coming home, getting access to peace of mind again. So if for that person's brain, doing drugs or overeating or drinking, if that looks like the only or the best way to kind of land, then the thoughts and the feelings of engaging in that is going to shoot up. Even if you speak with people who have suicidal thoughts, they're not usually looking to die necessarily, but they're in the torture chamber of their mind. And nothing else they've done has seemed to work. So the brain's creativity kind of throws up this idea of, well, you could just end it all. And that might look like a solution. Of course, it is a solution of sorts, but it, as the cliche goes, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem in the vast majority of cases. Now, if we look at depressing, one benefit sometimes of depressing is that if your life seems overwhelming, there's a lot of stuff going on and you feel, hopeless or helpless to deal with things, depressing, choosing to depress, so to speak, can be a way of stabilizing your world, because there are strong unwritten rules of how to deal with a person who's in pain, who's suffering. People often have a tendency to either take off, or they have a tendency to conform and to then begin to treat you as the depressed person. And that can give someone a sense of stability. Something else it might do sometimes is it might give people a sense of significance. That if life hasn't quite worked out, competing by being the person who has the big problem that never gets solved, being the person who has suffered the most, is the way that some people kind of get their sense of significance and uniqueness in life. It's kind of a low quality way of doing it, but for a lot of people, it works to some extent. And also, if people are part of, let's say, depression groups or something like that, their friendships, their friends are all depressed, right? And their identity is rooted in or revolves around a problem that they claim they want to solve, and which they kind of want to solve on many levels, but if you do so, you risk losing your identity and losing your social relationships. It's a bit like if you're a woman and you used to be obese and all your friends are obese. When you connect around food, and let's say that you lose a lot of weight and you get a lot more attractive and you get more attention from males and stuff like that, uh, don't be surprised then if your friends start to try to sabotage you, to eat your cookies and to kind of get back in line. Because your changes may be destabilizing for them, you know, might show them what's possible, and they might not prefer to think that they have those choices because those choices may infer or imply more responsibility than they're willing to take. Sometimes, if you look at kids or teenagers having psychosomatic symptoms or what we call a mental illness may be a way of stabilizing the family system. That if the parents are fighting all the time, if the kid can develop some sort of symptom that's serious enough, the parents might rally around the sick teenager. And in that sense, the teenager may stabilize the family system. It's really interesting too to look at, for example, young teenagers and young adults and even kids sometimes with various forms of symptoms, and to see how these can often function as indirect forms of communication. Now, of course, these are my interpretations and inferences. I can't prove that they're true in an ultimate sense, but I've lost track of how many teenage boys who stutter, who seem to have, especially mothers, who are overly controlling and invading in their lives. It's and sometimes I get the impression, I'm not saying that this is always the case, but I get the impression that some of the symptoms that kids and teenagers might develop are ways of saying fuck off. Like, back out of my life. Don't dictate me. This symptom is mine. You're not going to get rid of it. None of your experts are going to get rid of it. It's a way of kind of maintaining their own or generating some independence for themselves. If you look at eating disorders, for example, again, if you have a young woman who hasn't learned to deal with conflicts and emotions and thoughts in good ways, then trying to gain control by mastering food and mastering her body and becoming obsessed and super control freakish around that might give her a sense of accomplishment, a sense of control. A bit like the people who cut themselves, where you might say, why would anyone do that? Well, because they prefer the physical pain to the emotional pain. And because the emotional pain is perceived as involuntary and out of control, versus the physical pain is voluntary and in their control. And if you look at, for example, I'm convinced that what we call anorexia, for example, is very often a power game. I've seen this with clients. You have very often a young woman who's kind of power driven and who ends up having a sense of power over her parents that no teenager really should have. The parents might be terrified. Will she weigh, above or under the weight limit this time? Will she needs to be hospitalized? Will that new treatment regime work? Will she ever get better? And the daughter is kind of adjusting her weight up and down and keeping her parents tiptoeing around. And if you have honest conversations with people who do this, you'll very often see the glee and the sadism and the sense of power that very often comes along with that. And by viewing these things as illnesses that people are just suffering from, we do people a huge disservice, because even questioning in these directions, you become a heretic. It becomes automatically assumed that you're just an asshole who doesn't give a shit about anyone or anything. I talked a little bit about weight. Now, of course, it's not considered a mental illness either, but if you look at some people who have been sexually abused, I'm not even implying that all overweight people have been sexually abused or that most of them have or anything like that. But I've seen clients who, after resolving things, they've lost a lot of weight. And for some of them, having a lot of fat has been a way of kind of protecting themselves against sexual advances. Because as long as they're really, really fat, way fewer guys will come on to them in the same way. And if sexuality and stuff like that freaks them out, that can be a way of protecting. Now, of course, some people who have gone through sexual abuse may choose to deal with things in that way. Others might become hypersexual and essentially try to recreate the contexts and this time master them. That might be a way of gaining significance by being hypersexual. And of course, other people have been sexually abused and they don't attach a lot of meaning to it. So they're not really suffering. Their life doesn't revolve around that, at all. What else? Well, anxiety. Anxiety can be crippling. What could be the benefits of anxietizing? Well, when we're anxietizing, we're doing a lot of what if scenarios in our minds. Might be some benefits in testing out various solutions, troubleshooting, might help you come up with some solutions to things. Might even help you see dangers that your way less neurotic friends don't spot. There's also something else there, and that is that worry and anxiety can at times be a substitute for action. Because when people worry and do a lot of anxiety, they often feel like they're investing a lot and they're caring a lot about people in their lives. But they may not actually be engaging in anything or doing anything. But doing the worrying gives them the feeling, the kind of substitute for actual action, right? So that might be that might be a trap. It's a bit like the people who end up creating a life for themselves, gaming and on virtual reality and social media. It's sometimes a kind of low quality way of getting approval and validation and these sorts of things, but not really any risk, like the risk and the actual investment that comes from having real intimate relationships or kids or real friends, that sort of thing. I remember I saw a guy once for Fear of Flying who really loved his job. He worked in a company. He really loved the job where he was at and really wanted to stay there. His wife was more materialistic and more ambitious and really wanted him to accept a job offer that would, significantly increase his pay. Now, he wasn't really interested in that because he loved the job that he had in that particular company. The new job involved a lot of traveling, and my client had never had any problems with flying before. Suddenly now he started getting panic attacks on the flights. And it got so bad that he had to stop, and he was able to return to his previous position. What's the benefit here? Well, the benefit is he got his cake and he got to eat it too. Meaning he was able to say no to his wife indirectly. He was able to stay in his own job, but given that he had gone to a psychiatrist and now had claustrophobia and couldn't help it because he was suffering from a mental illness, she couldn't really blame him because it was a chemical imbalance in the brain, allegedly, after all. So for him, this was a great solution. Sometimes too, there's a wisdom in it. You may have people who, I've seen this too several times. You have people who have succeeded, but they've succeeded on other people's terms. They end up deeply depressed. And what people look as the illness or the problem may be the aspect of them with the most integrity, like some aspect that says, look, I'm not gonna sponsor this life. You're not being true to yourself, you're not being authentic, this isn't for you. And sometimes that level of pain can inspire someone to get real, to get honest, to begin to look at their life and how they're living it, and to develop the courage and the gusto to express their own voice in life at age 40 or 45 or 35 or 50 or whatever it might be. Now, you might ask, well, that's kind of nice, but what about the really serious stuff? What about schizophrenia, for example? So I used to know someone quite well. This was not a client, but I've also seen some clients in this domain. But I used to know someone quite well who was pretty power driven and had some good positions in his industry. And he ended up having some problems, some issues, and he ended up getting a diagnosis of MS after a surgery where he only had one of the symptoms, which was like a drop foot thing. So based upon that, he was able to get a pension, essentially. That was relatively good. But after a while, this person started hallucinating, got a schizophrenia diagnosis, started hallucinating that the FBI was after him and he was being wiretapped and, all sorts of stuff. Even people like me were being paid off by the FBI to spy on him and stuff like that. And you might ask, well, what on earth could be the benefit of this? Well, I think he longed for his old life. I think his drive for power and significance was very high, and that the life he now was living as an invalid of sorts didn't provide that. Now, consider it. If you're being wiretapped and spied on by the FBI and all sorts of stuff, you're important. You're a significant person. Things revolve around you. And I think that hallucinated reality of being a very important person, while painful, was preferable to the kind of actual reality that he was living in. After a while, he started developing some what we call physical symptoms, and the more actually sick he got in the literal sense, the more these sorts of hallucinations tapered off only to vanish. And in this case, I think it's legitimate to speculate that he no longer, in quotation marks, needed the old hallucinations as he got actually ill. So I hope if you're seeing clients for a living, I hope that these cases may have inspired you a bit in terms of thinking differently. If you are a person who is struggling and suffering, I'm going to invite you to contemplate that unless there's any evidence of brain pathology going on, and the whole chemical imbalance theory is as close to debunked as a theory can get. Read or watch Joanna Moncrief's talk on YouTube, The Myth of the Chemical Cure, to just disabuse yourself of that stuff. I'll invite you to contemplate what I've just said, and to contemplate if, given what you're thinking and believing, how your world kind of looks, whether what we call mental illness as a way of dealing with your unhappiness might be solutions to you that confer certain benefits. And if you can look honestly at that and kind of consider, am I choosing these things in some way? Then the door is wide open for you to begin to choose differently. And that's empowering. So anyways, if you have any comments, questions, feel free to post them where you find the video. If you like my style, if my ideas resonate with you, know that I see clients from all over the world on Skype. I also provide mentoring and seminars. You can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks for listening.